On September 11th, 2012, a group of Al-Qaeda terrorists stormed the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi. 4 Americans, including 2 Navy SEALs and the ambassador to Libya, were tragically killed as they tried to escort innocent people to safety. But to understand why this attack happened, we have to go back to 2011. Because in that year, the Libyan people rose up against their authoritarian government. And in an attempt to help them, the White House authorized over 1,000 airstrikes against government forces. Although the revolution eventually succeeded, the country quickly descended into a brutal civil war, as was explained by the professor back in the tent. A civil war which allowed for the rise of terrorist groups and killed over 200,000 people. The reason for this catastrophe is that there was no plan for what happened after the government fell. According to Professor Andrew Byers, quote, Congress was never consulted in the planning process or even authorized the use of military force. And because this is a tragedy that we cannot afford to repeat, I stand in the affirmative. The United States federal government should amend the War Powers Act to limit presidential power to initiate armed conflict. So for most of American history, Congress was the one to declare war. That's what the Constitution intends. And the framers designed our system so that no one power, no one organization, or no one person can have total control over war and peace. But recently, that has not been the case. Because according to Professor Sarah Burns, quote, since World War II, presidents regularly asserted their ability to initiate war unilaterally, that is, without consulting Congress, end quote. And the record speaks for itself. Between Vietnam, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and Iraq, all of our most recent wars have ended in failure. According to a study from the RAND Corporation, which is the leading think tank in foreign policy, 95% of America's conflicts prior to World War II ended successfully. But today, that percentage is down to less than half. But it doesn't have to be this way, because our military is still immensely capable. And when given the right leadership and tools, it can succeed. But for that to happen, for the military to return to its tradition of success, Congress must return to its role as the declarer and manager of war. As explained by Professor Lauren Schumann, a former member of the National Security Council, a, quote, engaged Congress can actively improve the conduct of American conflicts. And there are 2 reasons for this. The first is that congressional oversight can prevent unnecessary wars before they even begin. So under the current version of the War Powers Act, the president can drag the country into a conflict, and Congress can only step in 60 days later, but after the damage is already done. So if we change the rules to make sure that Congress can prevent the disaster before it happens, we can save countless lives and prevent a tragedy before it even happens. Take Somalia, for example, and the infamous Black Hawk Down incident that led to the deaths of over 80 American soldiers. Congress never authorized that war, but if they had the time to debate it and to deliberate it and to consider the benefits and the costs, it may never have happened. And those American lives may not have been so tragically wasted on such a futile conflict. This brings me to my second reason why congressional involvement improves military outcomes. So everyone can agree that having a clear plan and having clear goals is essential to success, especially in a military context, and I can assure you that the professor will say the same thing. But many of our recent wars have begun with neither clear goals nor a clear plan. I mentioned Libya earlier, but Afghanistan's also a great example. Because according to a report from the Congressional Research Service, the, quote, U.S. engagement in Afghanistan lacked a clear goal, end quote. And part of that reason was that it was never debated or authorized by Congress initially. Congress eventually gave appropriations for it, but that was only after we were already in there. So we weren't able to go in with a plan. Because we went into Afghanistan to fight Al-Qaeda. When that was no longer a threat, we stayed for decades and decades to fight off the Taliban and engage in a nation-building exercise that cost $6 trillion and 3,000 American lives, all for what? We can return to a tradition of success only if Congress returns to its constitutional powers as the declarer of war. Thank you. And then I'm ready for cross-examination.
All right, just give me 1 second.
Oh. And I'm just gonna put these on because the sun is like
glaring
down on
in your
those white
eyes.
tents, but I don't mean to be rude. I just my eyes I'm like squinting.
Absolutely. All right. 2 minutes left.
Yep.
All right. That was a great speech. I just have a few questions. So you said that since World War II, presidents have acted unilaterally and that less than 50% of wars have been successful. Does your, I don't know, what was the source? I believe it was a think tank you cited, cite exactly why those 50% of wars have been, or the successful number of wars has decreased? Or is there like a causal relationship? Does your source say that? Or?
Yes, definitely. So okay. I'd be happy to share you the study after the debate, but what it says is that the main two reasons for failure was the first is that we've had vague objectives, like as I mentioned with Afghanistan, and the second is that we've lacked popular support behind these initiatives. And the reason for that is that when the president just acts alone without the support of the country, the war's not going to go too well because everyone needs to band together for victory, but that doesn't happen when the president acts alone.
So next question, right after that, you talked about an engaged Congress improving decision making, right? Mm-hmm. So Congress has to be willing to check the power of the president for that to work, yes?
Yes, but right now, Congress isn't able to check the power of the president.
Right, so that would be my next point. What section of the War Powers Act specifically lets the president conduct operations without referencing Congress or any of those things, or conduct conflict without?
Yes, yeah. So that would be the 60-day and 48-hour clause. Because as a part of the War Powers Act, the president can do whatever he wants for the first 60 days. And we would amend it to change it so that the president has to ask for permission before he does anything. He doesn't have like a 60-day free play, does whatever he wants window.
Wait, to clarify, the president has to ask before he does anything? Before he sends any troops into conflict?
Before he engages in hostilities, yeah.
Okay, and then last question. You said Afghanistan was never debated. What about the 2001 AUMF? Congress literally debated and passed the AUMF, yet Afghanistan didn't go well.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and this will be our last question. So the AUMF was a post hoc approval. So we were already operating in Afghanistan, striking al-Qaeda targets prior to the passing of the AUMF. The Bush administration went ahead with it and then got Congress afterwards.
Okay, thank you. That answers all my questions. 5 minutes on the clock if you're ready. Yeah. Alright, are you ready? Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. I negate resolve the United States federal government should amend the War Powers Act to limit presidential power to initiate armed conflict. I want to start with the key idea that will drive this entire round. The geopolitical hotspot. A hotspot is a place where two nations or armed groups are locked in conflict over territory or power, with a single misstep being able to cause escalation. When a hotspot escalates, it fractures our alliances, destables the global order, and cuts the supply chains our economy runs on. That's why we have to watch them constantly, so the moment that one starts to slip, we can act before it becomes a war. That means rapid troop deployments and immediate military pressure when necessary. And we can only do that for one reason. The president can act in hours, not months. The Affirmative's amendment is only as strong as Congress's willingness to enforce it. Polarization has turned every vote into a party loyalty test. Without compromise, Congress stalls. The Affirmative amendment fixes nothing. It just pushes problems onto a divided Congress, unwilling to solve them. The Affirmative builds a world where every crisis waits on Congress while our enemies keep moving forward. This is contention 1. Precedential power is the only way to stop terrorists. Terrorist groups survive by moving faster than legislation can keep up. They hide in weak states and war zones, and the moment a country starts hunting them, they adapt. One of their oldest tricks is simply changing their name. As the Congressional Research Service explains, when a terrorist group changes its name, all laws and authorizations relating it to it become useless, and governments have to waste time passing new ones. For example, after the US spent years dismantling Al-Qaeda, one of its branches broke off and formed ISIS. In just a few years, ISIS controlled nearly 70,000 square miles of territory, ruling over roughly 8 million people. What stopped them was speed. Despite US laws not mentioning the newly formed ISIS, the president used an executive interpretation to order airstrikes, deploy special forces, and back local partners against ISIS without waiting months for Congress to approve each and every action. By 2019, ISIS held no territory, not even a single town under their possession. In the affirmative world, this precedential power disappears, and terrorists can avoid the US simply by changing their name. The war on terrorism is still going on. Less than a month ago, the president conducted a drone strike that killed 200 ISIS members, including their second-in-command. The affirmative takes away precedential power and flips the trend of declining terrorism. We give terrorists time to move, rebuild, and attack, exactly what the last 2 decades have spent trying to prevent. We've seen terrorists gain global power in under a year, and the affirmative hands terrorists all the time they could ever need. Moving on to contention 2, precedential power is needed to deter China from invading Taiwan. China's government has said numerous times this year that it wants to invade the island, and it's building up its forces. The Baker Institute of Politics writes that the American capacity to initiate armed conflict quickly is the primary reason the invasion hasn't happened yet. The affirmative erases this barrier. If China knows US reinforcements have to wait on a congressional vote, the deterrent is gone. China doesn't even need a full invasion to win. Political scientist Chris Miller explains that a blockade or missile campaign could cripple Taiwanese military and economy before American help arrives. The delay the affirmative creates is exactly the opening China needs. If Taiwan falls to China, the US economy will be hurt first. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company makes roughly 55% of the world's computer chips, which power nearly every modern technology from phones to dishwashers. Political scientists estimate that if the Chinese invasion were successful, the US would lose 1/3 of its total productive capacity, the economy would bleed $7.6 trillion in GDP, and over 60 million American workers would lose their jobs. In the modern world, time is a luxury and Congress waits it. Terrorists in China won't wait for America to catch up. They'll strike first, and by the time Congress finishes debating, the damage is already done. Precedential power is the only thing keeping hotspots from becoming catastrophes, and the affirmative trades it away for a vote that may never come. This is a race America cannot afford to lose, and for that reason, I proudly negate. Thank you, and I'm ready for cross-examination.
Okay, awesome. Put up this chair. Yeah, I'm good.
All right, great.
So 2 minutes for cross-examination. So, would you say that right now terrorism is a problem, is a threat?
Is terrorism a problem? I would say that terrorism has been declining. We've been mitigating terrorism. It was a much bigger problem in the early 2000s and 2010s, but US efforts and constant pressure have reduced the presence of terrorists.
Okay, so by how much would you say that they've reduced the presence?
Well, if we look back to my ISIS example, we can see that ISIS had 70,000 square miles of territory, ruled over 8 million people. Right now, ISIS has no territory and no people, but they still pose a threat because they have arms and they're still recruiting and have militants acting. They keep moving continents, keep changing their names, keep forming branches, and the rest of the world, other world governments, can't keep up.
Okay,
only the US can.
Interesting, thank you. So what about the Taliban? Are they still a threat?
By the Taliban, do you mean Al-Qaeda? Taliban has multiple branches. If we're talking about 9/11.
No, I mean the Taliban, the
group
organization that's currently ruling Afghanistan right now.
What about them specifically?
Like, do they still pose a terror threat to the United States?
Do they still pose a terror threat to the United States? I mean, they could pose a terror threat to the United States. U.S.-Afghani relations are still in sort of a muddle or maybe a mess. We're still dealing with them. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. So, and then I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're short on time
Sure.
here. So for the Taiwan argument, so what was that source again that said U.S. fast-acting ability is uniquely key to protecting Taiwan? So
It was the
source?
Baker Institute for Policy.
Interesting. So, like, I know you might not have the source with you, but, like, what exactly did they say to quote from the article?
I mean, I can pull it up if you want.
Yes, if you
Right.
could, that would be great.
I can quote from it directly if that would make it easier. Okay.
And then that could be, once you get that.
Right, yeah, last answer. Got it. You just Control F to find it. Sorry, my computer is deciding to be...
I understand. He's probably not helping.
Yeah. There we go. Baker Institute. If a U.S. administration were ever to lack the resolve to ensure air and maritime passage to Taiwan using force, China's attitude might well change. If China succeeded in becoming the Silicon hegemon by coercing Taiwan economically or militarily, Beijing would have considerable leverage over the chip industry. It is far better to deter the PRC from ever seizing control to become a Silicon hegemon. Preventing a potential takeover of TMC will require a holistic set of military responses to help shore up and safeguard Taiwan comprehensively. However, having the credible capacity to engage those forces on a large and sustained scale would complicate Beijing's decision.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. All right, and then for prep time, I'm going to take 2 minutes and then get back to you.
Do you want to move this table in at all in the shade? Would that help or no?
That
I would be willing to do that, yeah.
Thank you.
It's like you guys are in suits.
I know.
Sweating.
I didn't know I would need to bring a towel.
And you can even move it back more. I don't need a lot of space. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Thank you. Got the sweat beads dripping down my face.
I bet.
If I had a handkerchief, I'd offer it to you. All right. So if everyone is ready? Mm-hmm. Awesome. So this is the affirmative rebuttal. It's going to be 4 minutes long. All right. President Coolidge once said that it pays to be at peace. Well, I have to ask you, we've been at war for nearly the last 25 years. The 25 years since 9/11. And what have these wars paid us? How have we benefited from them? How have we become safer, more secure, or more prosperous? I think in many ways we haven't. We've been even for the worse. It's kind of the overarching theme of this speech, and I will explain it in relation to my opponent's first point about stopping terrorism. So my opponent argues that swift, decisive action is needed to combat it. And I think that's a reasonable idea. Terrorism is bad and we want to stop it. I talked about the terrorist attack in Benghazi, how tragic that was. But I have to ask you, has it been successful in stopping terrorism? Because the president has been launching these terror strikes since 9/11, since 25 years ago, and terrorism is still a major problem today, as my opponent acknowledged. He said it's declining, but I have reason to doubt that for two reasons. The first, he mentioned that ISIS isn't a threat anymore, but if that's the case, why did the president order a strike on 200 ISIS members a month ago? I thought they had no more troops, no more army. But if they have 200 soldiers, at least, they can be killed in one strike, then why are they still a threat now? What I know for certain is that all terrorism is still not gone. Look at the Taliban, for example. We spent $6 trillion and 3,000 American lives to dislodge them from Afghanistan. Well, guess what? They're ruling Afghanistan today. Because this strategy of drone strikes and airstrikes against terrorist groups isn't working. It hasn't worked in the past, and we have no reason to suggest that it's going to work in the future. Because when the president acts without the support of America, without the support of the Congress, without the support of the general public writ large, we aren't going to lead to success. And a broken strategy is still broken no matter how many times you try. I mean, they call it the definition of insanity for a reason, but we are not an insane people or an insane country, so we shouldn't keep acting like it. Then on to his second point about the Taiwan escalation. So in cross-examination, you'll remember that I asked him to read from the evidence. And I know that might seem semantic and kind of nitpicky or whatever, but it is important. Because if you listen to what he was saying from that card, it's not saying what he thinks it does. Because there was no mention in there of the president's ability to act quickly. Didn't even say president at all. It talked about how we need to show resolve to win the war against China if it were to come. And I agree. We need to show our resolution. But we can only do that if Congress is in support of the war. Think about it. If the president decided to drag the country into a war tomorrow without ensuring that the people voted for it, that the people want it, what would happen? Well, we're seeing that right now in Iran. The people haven't voted on the current conflict, and whatever you think of it, it hasn't gone quite up to our expectations. So my fear is that if the president does drag us into a war with China without the support of Congress, as his evidence acknowledges, we may not win. We may not do too well. But on that argument about China, I agree. Hotspots are a big deal and they're a big problem. We have to be careful about them. So having a president being able to unilaterally move troops around and blow up his enemies whenever he feels like it, that's dangerous. That's unprincipled. And worst of all, it's reckless. And you're playing a reckless game with our security. Think about it. Imagine if the president, like our current one, who, whatever you may think of him, is quite hot-headed and quite reckless, decides to airstrike a Chinese military installation on a whim without the support of Congress. That could easily drag us into an unpopular and losing war for the United States, which would be terrible for everyone. Thank you.
I have 5 minutes of prep time, so I'm just going to start running that now. All right. Okay. Okay, I'm just gonna move this chair around and
I'm ready.
all right, my judge, are you ready? All right, fantastic. I'm going to start with my opponent's first case. Their contention is basically about how open debate in Congress leads to better strategies, better priorities, better planning. Debate is actually the problem. War does not wait for the perfect strategy. Messy, quick actions can save more lives and prevent escalation. My opponent cited one source, one war, Afghanistan, but I have a study of every U.S. military action after the War Powers Resolution was passed, and it found that quick deployment reduced the chance of escalation in 73% of cases. That's approximately 196 conflicts that quick deployment has prevented, and with those conflicts, hundreds of thousands of lives. Oftentimes, when we're doing military calculations, we only look at the bad instances, but we forget to look at the good ones, because it's the lives we saved, and that's harder to count. Even when Congress wants to act, it universally and historically has struggled. Restricting the precedent takes bipartisan coalitions, a majority crossing party lines that says this goes too far. But as political scientist Gordon Friedrichs explains, polarization has turned every vote into a party loyalty test. Even under the War Powers Act right now, Congress hasn't been able to stop the precedent in 3 years. That's not because the law is bad, it's because polarization is preventing them from doing it. Without compromise, Congress stalls. I mentioned this in my constructive, but my opponent never responded to it. The affirmative amendment, again, doesn't fix anything. It leans on the same divided Congress. New law, same broken incentives. The precedent keeps operating. After 9/11, Congress gave the president permission to go after Al-Qaeda under the 2001 AUMF. Now, my opponent says this didn't have an impact, but Al-Qaeda broke apart and formed ISIS. Now, my opponent tells you that we're still fighting ISIS. They still have 200 troops. But so what? They had 70,000 square miles and ruled over 8 million people. We freed those 8 million people. That's 70,000 square miles of territory. We reduced their numbers from nearly 30,000 to under 500. That is a major accomplishment. And that shows that U.S. efforts have consistently been able to fend off terrorism. The next point is about the War Powers Act itself. It doesn't actually give the president authorization to deploy troops in areas that are not already under hostilities, or that the president doesn't have power under Article 2 of the Constitution. The War Powers Act fundamentally is a reporting mechanism. It makes sure that when the president takes action without consulting Congress, he has to report it to Congress. And after 60 days, Congress can stop that action regardless of what it is. It's not something that allows this presidential action. The presidential action itself is allowed by other laws, specifically the 2001 AUMF. That's Congress's law allowing presidential action, not the War Powers Act. And my opponent can't respond to this. They're not reforming the AUMF, they're reforming the War Powers Act. The final thing that I want to talk about is China. The U.S. administration, as my card said, U.S. administration refers to the president, has to show military force or presence in China. Otherwise, China will become more aggressive and more likely to invade Taiwan. That's a summary of what the card says. Resolve, yes, it mentioned that word and my opponent focused on it. But it also said that the U.S. capacity to credibly engage China was the primary reason that China hadn't invaded yet. But my opponent ignored that line. My opponent conceded in cross that his amendment would restrict all troop deployments. This means that if the China situation were ever to escalate, the US couldn't deploy more troops without consulting Congress. The average time it takes for Congress to pass a law or authorize an action is 215 days. That's 7 months that China has to invade Taiwan. And as my political scientist Chris Miller said, it would only take them about a week. China will escalate. And if the affirmative resolution, their amendment goes through, we take away the only deterrence we have. For that reason, I ask you to affirm. Or negate, sorry.
All right, I will take the remaining 3 minutes of my prep time, then I'll get back to the final speech.
When I was young, my father would always reach me with stories, but he stopped at the ASAP, and I'd always beg her to tell me all the stories. That's going to play a key role in this game. Affirmative has given you a target version of defense, but we need to negotiate so that story. Let me respond to the item first. One, already portions of ballot. The War Powers Resolution already requires that by the within 48 hours after any meeting of the law also already states that the president is not under the emergency, criticizing attack on the invoke the war on Iran and the Gulf War. Congress is further funding and military will Congress stop the president. Two, congressional approval does not guarantee success like they said, and many times it actually fails. For example, Vietnam had the Gulf War, Iran had the 2002 authorization. Fourth, all of this has congressional approval, but this approval did not get off and top one. That's the rest of the story. Additionally, we have additional history says otherwise. Affirmative actual congressional approval creates other strategies. But once again, Congress approved the Vietnam, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. Before the United States carries out an attack, we're not have no information. We already have our own research on conflict. When was Congress ever led to the United States government having more information being given at blind right? We've never seen that in the past before. Additionally, it's some examples of what happens when you go through congressional approval. For example, in 2013, the Obama administration asked for congressional approval, and we only found out.
All right. All right, so this is the affirmative closing speech. I have 4 minutes. You ready? Awesome. So my opponent began his previous speech by saying that, quote, debate is actually the problem. And if that's true, I have to ask him, why are we doing all this? And now I know he'll say that it's different. Congressional debate is long, it impacts decision-making, yada yada, whatever. But in many ways, it's actually not. Because what we're doing right now, debating this resolution, is exactly what they're doing in Congress. And it has the same goal, which is ultimately creating, refining, and delivering the best policy through clashing with ideas. In the same way that myself and my opponent debating back and forth about this issue is going to leave you better informed about which policies we should take in the real world, congressmen debating back and forth in Congress is going to allow them to find the best issue and the best way to approach foreign policy in our world, when our safety depends on it, and it's about more than just the ballot or whoever wins Coolidge. but about whether or not we go to war and important decisions like that. But the same principle applies. So that is really the thesis of my argument, and this debate comes down to one question. How do we balance good decisions versus quick decisions? Because my opponent talks a lot about the need to go fast, the need to be speedy. And that's true. There is a value and an importance to that. But how do we balance that against the importance of making well thought out and well planned decisions about when we go to war? So I think we should prioritize good quality over speed for a few reasons, and that's what I'll get into. So they make this argument that 70% of interventions that were successful utilize speed. So whether or not you accept that figure is whatever, but needless to say, that figure doesn't take into account something that's very important, that Congress can be fast as well. I know my opponent said that Congress takes a while on average for most debates and most bills, but that doesn't have to be the case in terms of war powers. I'll give you an example. The professor in the tent, she mentioned how during the Mexican-American War, Congress made a decision in 2 days. And think about it. That was back in like the 1840s, when transportation and communication was slow, they didn't have the internet, they had to use like horses and buggies to all get everyone to Congress, and there were people coming from all across the country. Today, Congress can make decisions very, very quickly. And they can also do it deliberately and in a thought-out manner as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a choice between good and quick decisions if the people who make good decisions can also make them quickly. And then on to these points about terrorism and ISIS. So whatever you may believe, whether or not terrorism is a problem right now or whether it's lessening, an important point remains. My opponent mentioned this over and over again in their speech, but Congress authorized strikes against terrorism through the 2001 authorization for use of military force. And if that's the case, then why can't Congress authorize future terror attacks? I know my opponent mentioned that groups splinter and the names change, but that bill, that authorization, had it in a clause saying that the government could pursue Al-Qaeda and associated groups, meaning that it gave broad permission to the executive. So, in many ways, we had the best of both worlds. Because we had congressional authorization, we had congressional debate, but we also gave the president broad powers to adjust different terrorist groups when they came up, when they rose, and when they fell. So really, this debate comes down to a prioritization of quick versus well thought out and good decisions. I think sometimes speed is necessary, and there can be accommodations for that. But ultimately, when lives are on the line, sometimes hundreds of thousands, I think we need to think things out. We need to think things through before we send American men and women to die overseas and jeopardize our safety and yours. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to use the rest of my remaining prep time.
That's why I put that part in there about having a the authorization. I think that this main change that we see is going to make it to where we are going to less the message. And a couple of members decided to cut the fact that
My opponent correctly pointed one thing out, that I was going to say that the debate we're doing now is the reason that is fully different from the debate in Congress. And the reason for that is this, the timer. We have a set number of speeches, a set number of rounds. Each round is 40 minutes. Congress doesn't have a timer. The average bill, and that includes military bills, takes 215 days to pass. The average authorization takes even more. That's 7 months to a year that every congressional action, every congressional authorization has to go through. My opponent talks about the Mexican-American War and how Congress acted in 2 days. But the reason that the only example that they could give of Congress acting was from the 1800s was because the modern day is fundamentally different. Polarization has turned the incentives for congressmen. Notice how my opponent never responds to this because it kills their entire case. The War Powers Act, their amendment, it all still relies on Congress to be willing to enforce the law. The problem is they aren't. President Calvin Coolidge understood that the test of a law isn't how good it sounds, it's what it does when it's on the books. He said it matters more to kill a bad bill than to pass a good one, because a law that gets it wrong does more harm than no law at all. That is the Affirmative's amendment. It promises a check on the president, but what it delivers is a country that cannot move. It takes the one power that lets us answer threats in hours and hands it to a Congress that takes months, if it acts at all. My opponent himself said the world is getting faster. So when the next crisis comes, we don't respond carefully. We don't respond at all. The affirmative doesn't restrain power. It strips away our defense and calls it reform. Coolidge wouldn't trade the nation's safety for a good-sounding bill, reject their empty promise, and negate. Now, the second point I want to move on to is speed, because that's what the whole round comes down to. In the negative, the moment a hotspot starts to split, whether that be China, Taiwan, the terrorists, any hotspot in the world, we can move before it becomes a war. Troops, pressure, a response measured in hours, not months. Our rivals know it. Terrorism, that is why terrorism has declined. ISIS's troops reduced by 95%. They don't control a single town. The impact is there and it's very real. But in their world, that same hotspot waits on a Congress that has historically refused the vote. They talked about passing new AUMFs. Congress hasn't passed a new authorization in 25 years. They are polarized and they lack the incentives to do so, but they keep relying on them. The affirmative world isn't Congress decides instead of the president, it's no one decides at all, and a hotspot left to slip doesn't remain contained. It fractures our alliances, freezes the supply chain our economy runs on, and drags the whole global order down with it. The damage is done by the time Congress finishes debating. Prefer the world that can still act and negate. The final point that I want to bring in this entire round is reality. What world we're functioning in now. True, maybe we can talk about precedential power in abstract. We can talk about decision-making in abstract. But the problem is that the United States is deeply integrated within the global order, and our enemies and allies are watching every move we make. It's not about the hypothetical, it's about the reality. It's about the Chinese threats that are active to invade Taiwan. It's about the terrorists that keep on reinforcing arms, and we have to keep taking them down. Our efforts are working, we just have to keep at it. But the affirmative gives up, and that's the problem. We risk all this escalation, we risk war, we risk our supply chains, and for what? An idea? An idea that has shown it doesn't work in practice? I reject that, and I believe that you should too, and for that reason I urge you to vote negative. Thank you. Good round.
Good round. Yes.
Good job, guys. You're wearing a vest too. Oh my god.
Oh my, yeah. It's like I started wearing it my freshman year of high school. Then I was like, I'm committed to this. No matter what, I have to
your
wear
thing
it.
now?
Yeah, it's my thing now. I have to be in the vest.
Good job, both of you. That was
Thank you.
impressive.
I would shake your hand if it wasn't sweating so much.
That's okay, no worries.
Good round? I'll shake your hand.
I'll see you in the air conditioning.
Yeah.
Hopefully we
Yeah,
can
you
find
guys
it.
deserve some time in the air conditioning for sure.
Well, thank you for judging.